Hi, everyone, and welcome to Entering the Research Conversation with Ethics. Ethics is concerned with the principles of right and wrong, but this can get complicated because right and wrong really depends on the lens you're approaching the situation with. Here are some brief different ways to look at ethical pursuits. I'm going to go over each of these in greater detail, but there is freedom, reason, the greater good, utilitarianism, and loving perception. First, freedom comes from David Hume. Human beings are naturally good and want freedom for one another, and if given the opportunity, will grant it to one another. Now, the thing is that as we found throughout history, that while humans do want to be free to make their own decisions, they also like to control others, as we can see through colonialism, where one country seizes another and exploits it, as we can see through slavery, as one person attempts to own other people. So we know that overall, while we don't want to say that people are intrinsically bad, while they do want freedom for themselves, they may not want it for others. And even sometimes we've found that people can really respond well to authoritarianism. Someone who tells them what to think and how to act. Some people find that very soothing. That's how cults start. So there is this idea, does everyone really want freedom for themselves and others? Not always. There's also reason. Some people are more capable of reason than others. And love and civility are reserved for those people that are able to act in reasonable ways. In some ways, we want to say yes. We want people who are making good decisions to be in charge. We want to connect ourselves to people who are making good decisions. And that can be a productive ethic. At the same time, it has been a justification for enslaving people, saying, well, we are smarter with better reason than these people, so they shouldn't be allowed to have the same rights that we have. It was a reason women were not allowed to vote. It was this idea that women are incapable of making a rational decision, so they shouldn't be allowed to choose our leader. So it can be, so reason can become the justification for not allowing people opportunities. Now, it also has been the reason why they say people are not adults till they're 18 and they have guardians, and why some people that are experiencing mental illness or people who are for some sort of cognitive issues might have a guardian. So in some ways, this reason is embedded in our society in good ways to protect people and to have people making sound decisions in charge. However, there are people that will exploit this, and that is how people become marginalized. There's utilitarianism. What is right is not the agent's own happiness, but the rights of all considered. What is best for the most people, people over the longest period of time? Well, I'll give you an example of utilitarianism. You can kind of decide how utilitarian you are. Imagine you are hiding from murderers with multiple other people in a closet. In that closet is a baby. The baby starts to cry. That baby's going to give us all away. Do you smother that baby to save everybody else or not? Do you try to find another way? In that moment, utilitarianism would say killing that baby is going to save the most people. But utilitarianism does not think about the personal. So when we think of it's going to cost so much money to save this one cancer patient, it's probably better for society to let that cancer patient die. But there's a humanitarian spot that says, well, it might be best for society. I have a desire to save this person because I'm empathetic and I feel suffering. So that's where utilitarianism goes back and forth. When we only think of the greater good, we forget about individuals and their individual experiences. You can decide where you land on that because people have different degrees of utilitarianism. There's also loving perception, or agape, and this is by Maria Lugones. And there is this idea that one must be a world traveler. Empathize, take time and know and become at ease with others. Don't be arrogant that you know better or are better. Empathize and understand. Now, this can get complicated. I'll give you an example. There was one performer of narrative who went into prisons to talk to people who were in prison, and she then performed their stories for an audience in a very empathetic way without judgment. Some of these women did absolutely horrific crimes. They killed their children in order to keep a boyfriend, or they shot innocent people to death to get drug money. And so the idea that she performed with such a loving perception is just to share their story with empathy without that critical analysis got pushback from her audience. So there is this idea of even when we have loving perception, it's okay to honor our own reactions, that while we can see a system of class and race and gender and sexuality that might be oppressing this person in many different ways. Of course, it's oppressing them in some way. We can't say all the nuances depending on their particular situation. That doesn't mean we have to excuse all the behavior that's happening. And so we can have that push and pull of being empathetic to cultural position without dismissing what can be considered and are considered by general society as very negative or violent actions. So that's the idea. With loving perception means approaching with empathy, but the danger of loving perception, just like every ethical framework has a danger, is excusing and turning into a realistic that everyone is just operating from their own place, rather than having some sense of cultural ethics of right versus wrong. So how do we apply this in our lives as researchers? Be open about your intentions from the beginning with your superiors. If you're going to do published research with a university, you need to let people know what you're doing and what your motivations are. We have to get approval by the research review board to make sure what we're doing is ethical and right and causing the least amount of harm possible to our participants and subjects. With your participants or subjects, now know that some people consider their participants co-creating the data with them. Others see their participants as more detached subjects. Just depends on what frame you're coming from. But either way, how honest are you going to be? What are your intentions? And you'll work that out with your superiors when you do publishable research. You'll talk with them about, well, how much these people actually need to know in order to keep themselves safe without interrupting my study or ruining my study. And that's why there's questions of going undercover. For example, there was a professor in sociology who went undercover at a trans bar, And at that trans bar, while he was undercover, he was able to form a lot of relationships with the people there, and he wrote an ethnographic study on these people of this bar, and he used a lot of very identifying information. And so a lot of these people that were there felt that book put them at risk. He ended up losing his job at that university because he hadn't gotten IRB approval. He had not received permission to go undercover. So while if you're working for a newspaper or you're working for any kind of journalistic area, going undercover is celebrated. Police officers go undercover all the time. As academic researchers, when we go undercover depends on whether or not our institution finds it necessary, and whether or not we expose who our participants are with their names and identifying information is going to depend on the study. Usually we tend to lean towards confidentiality of not allowing people to know who our participants are. For example, when I was doing research with people who self-identified as physically disabled professionals, I often would not give their exact diagnosis, would not say their exact state they were in, would not say their exact job. I might say he is a doctor instead of exactly what kind of medicine he practiced, and that he uses a wheelchair instead of he has polio, because if I narrowed it down too much, everyone would know exactly who he was. And so there is this idea that we try our best to keep identities confidential to avoid them having negative ramifications when our study comes out. So remember, an institutional review board, it can feel overwhelming. If any of you do theses, you're going to maybe feel like, oh my gosh, this takes so long to go through the institutional review board or the IRB. But know that it was put into place because people had questionable ethics that were not acting in a loving perception and doing to do the least harm as possible. Here's some of the examples of why we have an IRB. The Tuskegee Syphilis experience. In 1932, in Alabama, they let African American male prisoners keep suffering with syphilis, not letting them know that there was now a cure in order to watch how bad syphilis could become. So these people were exploited. They were not told enough about the study, that this study is to allow you to slowly die of syphilis so we can watch, even though there is now a cure we're not going to tell you about. So that's when we said, you know what, you need to let your participants know what's happening and let them be able to make an informed decision if they want to participate with you. Nazi prison experiments. We know a lot about freezing and hypothermia, about genetics and DNA, about infectious disease, interrogation and torture, high altitude, sterilization, and traumatic injuries by the research done in Nazi prison camps. But as we found, freezing people to death, and they injected blue dye into people's eyes to see if they could dye their eyes. They exposed them to infectious disease to watch how fast it spread. They did torturous things to see how much pain someone could take before they would give someone information. They put them in altitude chambers to watch to see how quickly a pilot would die if their plane was crashing at high altitudes. They did sterilizations on them to see what are some effective different kinds of treatment for sterilizations when people did not want to be sterilized. They inflicted traumatic injuries on them to see how much they could take before they died and how those traumatic injuries would heal. So while we learned a lot about life and being human from these different experiments, they were of course horrific. People were put to death for doing it. And we now know that just because we are discovering new knowledge doesn't mean it's okay to do. The Milgram Psychological Experiment. In 1961, a series of studies were trying to see how brainwashed into cruelty people could be. Part of this was to try to understand how Nazi Germany happened. So what they would do is they had a really nice, sweet-looking man behind glass, and they kept telling people, you need to administer these shocks to him. And even when the person would say, I don't want to give him any more shocks because it looks like he's dying, he wasn't really, it was all an actor. They would do it because they felt research in society depended on it because they had a very persuasive researcher telling them to do it. And that's how they see that if there's a superior telling you to do something and that it's for the greater good of humanity and this person deserves this, you can be convinced to do it. Of course, this resulted in deep psychological harm to those people, and it was said this was dangerous and not the kind of psychological experiments they should have had to undergo just for the sake of this study. And this is the whole question of you really should reveal as much as possible to people. The Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, Stanford recruited college students to participate in a 2-week experiment to simulate prison guard and prisoner dynamics. What they did was they randomly assigned them to one or the other, and then they either threw them in prison and had other students have control over the prison. It got violent. The prisoners attempted suicide. They attempted mutiny. There was the prison guards got more and more angry and more violent. They had to cut the experiments short because it was getting so damaging. And that's when we realized we need to give people full understanding of what's going on and the right to at any time say, I don't want to participate anymore because of this kind of danger that can happen. So the IRB ensures that humans are aware of the intent of any study. Now, sometimes we do need to keep things confidential. I'll give an example. One of my friends that I went to graduate school with, he was doing a psychology experiment on how long men would look at graphically violent sexual footage. And what and he would be able to measure eye movements to see how long they would look. And there was a study that then to have them do a questionnaire to see how prone to physical and sexual violence they would be based on how long they were willing to look at these pictures. What he found, though, he did get approval from the IRB not to tell them what the study was about, but they could choose not to participate at any time. And if he saw harm coming to them, he had to stop the experiment. And so for several of the men that were seriously getting very traumatized and frightened and upset, He just stopped the study right away. And said, listen, this doesn't seem like it's very safe for you anymore. Let's stop right here. And they could also say, I'm not doing it anymore. Whenever you conduct an interview, people have the right to end that interview at any time. If they're feeling uncomfortable, they don't have to keep talking to you. The people understand the risks going into the study. We might say, the only risk is what would be of having a normal conversation. If it's sensitive data, saying you might share something that makes you feel uncomfortable or relive a traumatic experience that you're having. And while everything will be kept confidential, emotionally that might be there. And then there is the idea, when Matt did his study, he said, listen, you're going to be seeing some graphic images. You can stop at any time. So make sure they understand the risk that these might be too violent of images for you to see. And then the risks are minimized as much as possible. For example, how we minimize the risks of it being a very sensitive story that could hurt their image is we would take out identifying information to make sure that nobody can tell it's them. And that idea of risks are minimized, that Matthew, once things got to a certain level, would just stop the experiment and make sure that that person stayed safe. So throughout your research process, seek permission, make sure they're okay with you listening to, okay with telling you the story. Make sure you can't have a phone call with a friend and be secretly recording it as your research data. You have to tell them we're having a narrative interview. I'm going to record it and I'm going to transcribe pieces of it to analyze. They need to know that because that's important. If you're going to be performing that person's story, you should say, I'm doing this interview so that I can perform, right? They should be, if you're going to be doing a documentary style, they should know that that's what you're doing here, that this isn't just for you, or the camera shouldn't be hidden. The same way if you're taking notes in a public place, if someone asks you what you're doing, you should be honest and tell them that that's the study that you're doing. That matters. Trust your participants if you would like them to trust you. That idea of listen to them and let them have a person who is being respectful and a kind, empathetic audience during that story, just like you would want them to be as authentic and open as they can with you. Protect identities unless participants knowingly give up the right and want to be known. So if someone says, no, this is my story and I want credit for it, great. Otherwise, the default is use a different name. We call that a pseudonym. And take out identifying information that would obviously show that's who it is. So things like blonde hair, brown hair, race, those usually don't need to be changed. You can just leave those there. But if it's something extremely specific, I'll give an example. One student was interviewing a person on campus that had albinism, was an albino, and because they were the only person on campus that anyone really knew that was albino, they had to just be willing to have their identity possibly be known. So be aware of that. If it's something that is extremely specific that people around you have seen, we might know who we're talking about. Also, be reciprocity, compensation, empathy, credit, advocacy. Are you doing anything to make the world better by telling this story? Advocate for them. Sometimes people give them compensation. I've never actually done compensation, but I have always been an empathetic listener. And that means also not just running off. Sometimes I've stayed and had coffee and spent some time and stayed with that person a bit if they would like me to make sure I am investing in them and disclosing about myself just like they're disclosing about themselves. That's not always necessary. I've only done that if requested. Also, use rigor and fairness in the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data. Don't manipulate and take things out of context to make a story that's not really there. That's not right to do. You want to give the most open, honest interpretation of this data as possible, to be fair and rigorous, spending the time investing, collecting that data. And know that even with all this work, people may ask, why should we believe you? And know that tell them you are learning methodology. This is research methodology. There's a purpose to it. You are coming from a particular paradigm. You have a standpoint of where you're looking at it from with reflexivity, and you have detailed steps of your analysis. This is rigorous work, and it matters. And know that you are within a discipline that is using established methodology. If appropriate, you can also seek out triangulation or collaboration from others researchers with coding. So you might say, I think this is what's emerging here. You might ask a friend, you might ask me, do you see the same thing? And that's a way too, if you're unsure, to get another perspective. And also always keep in mind, truth is always situated in the act of embodied data collection. Your body's collecting this data. You have bias. You're going to be as self-reflexive as you can be, as honest, as open, as empathetic as you can be. Your story is situated in history. It can inform or disrupt dominant meanings. So know that. Remember, there are systems of power that motivate us to tell stories, to interpret, see things in certain ways, to have opinions. Be aware that that exists. None of us are in a vacuum. We're always being impacted by the culture around us. Realize that there can be pragmatic or political use. You should have a point of why you did this in relation to your audience, the participant, and what it means to be human. Remember, coherence, persuasion, presentation, be careful analysis, make sure your presentation is organized well, lots of direct quotes throughout, because that's what's powerful. That's your data.